Hey there, listeners. Welcome back to The AMP, your favorite podcast for elevating voices in skills training and empowering change through workforce policies. I'm your host, Tianna Montgomery, and today we're facing our fears. And when I say fears, I'm not talking about the spider that's crawling underneath your bed, nor am I talking about the public speaking class that you barely got through in college. I'm talking about the fear of the unknown, especially when it comes to stepping into new career paths, training programs, or even something as big and scary as federal advocacy. Okay, it's not that dramatic, I promise. But let's be real, when people hear the words federal advocacy, they often picture something straight out of the Matrix. I'm talking the Smiths with the stiff suits and not too much motion going on. You might also find some confusing policy jargon in there, or think about the maze that is Capitol Hill that's probably only suited for seasoned insiders. But today we're breaking that myth wide open. I'm joined by the brilliant, although Philadelphia Eagles fan, Brooke DeRenzis. We won't hold it against her because, well, she knows her stuff, so a win is a win. Brooke is here to help us demystify what federal advocacy actually is and how it shapes the workforce policies that impact our lives, and how you can get involved, even if your only experience with politics is binge watching The West Wing. I'm a fan. Or you just simply like yelling at C-SPAN. We'll also talk about how NSC is holding it down in DC, making sure workers and businesses have a seat at the policy table. No secret handshake required. This is not the Little Rascals, unfortunately. But justice in the workforce, right? That's not a luxury. It's a necessity. And we're here to make sure no community gets left behind. So first, let's face that fear, and onward to episode 2, Fear of the Unknown, with Brooke DeRenzis. Hello, Brooke. Welcome to our second episode of The AMP. How are you?
I'm good, Tiana. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's a beautiful day outside, no more rain.
I'm glad to see the sunshine.
Yes. So tell us a little bit about your role and about the role that NSC plays in federal advocacy.
Yeah, sure. So I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at National Skills Coalition, and I really think of my role as a bridge between kind of our mission and our vision and the change that we want to see in the world, and then how all of our policy advocacy and organization and organizing gets us there.
So, for listeners who may not be familiar, how would you describe federal advocacy to people who have no idea what federal advocacy is, and how does it shape workforce policies?
Yeah, of course. So, federal elected officials, the president and Congress, they make decisions through laws and through federal spending that impact all of us, right? So, for example, we might see Congress decide to make changes to workforce laws through something like changing the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which is the primary workforce law in our country. We might also see them make decisions about the level of spending to put into certain workforce programs. And for workforce, many of the education and training programs that working people and local businesses access in their communities are either supported or shaped by federal policy in some way. So that's how federal policy really kind of shapes workforce. When it comes to advocacy, I always think about advocacy as telling policymakers where you stand on an issue and why you have the position you have. And oftentimes it's also about asking them to take action on an issue as well, right? So we oftentimes at National Skills Coalition work with our networks to ask federal policymakers to keep existing programs going or to make a change to a policy based on the impact that it has in communities. And I found that people are often motivated to take action or to advocate when a federal policy impacts, our lives, our families, our businesses, if we're small business owners, our schools, our communities. So a big thing that we do at National Skills Coalition is work with all of our network members who are on the ground to show public support for policies and investments that positively impact workers and small businesses and communities, and then trying to change those policies that create barriers.
Right. So I'm glad you brought up the fact that like a lot of these policies they work for small businesses and workers. Just the other day I saw a TikTok, and it's fair because not a lot of people would really dig into these policies and know exactly what it's going to affect and what funding comes from it.
Yeah.
So I was watching this TikTok and this man, rightfully so, was so irate because he had lost so much funding for his business, which essentially was his farm and his cattle and things like that. And the funding was coming from the Inflation Reduction Act.
Mhm.
He had no idea that that's where that funding came from. I say that to say a lot of people don't know how to advocate for these policies because they're not in tune as to what they do, what they help. So I guess for that man, what would he do specifically if he called himself a federal advocate for workforce policies and wanted to, try and get his money back from the Inflation Reduction Act for his farm, for his business?
Yeah, so, I mean, National Skills Coalition provides a platform for our coalition members to educate federal policymakers and engage with them, right? And so if we think about members of Congress, we work with members of Congress, they and their staffs, they know that jobs in the economy matter for the people and the communities they represent. But National Skills Coalition helps those members of Congress, helps those staff see how policies that support high quality skills training, that support career pathways, that support supportive services are really key to meeting their community's needs on good jobs and shared economic prosperity, right? We put forward
Right.
recommendations to policymakers about changes they can take, funding that they can support. To support the goals that their communities have. And I'm really proud of the way that we do that work, right? We have a really talented staff, but we
Yes, we
also
do.
are a coalition. And to the question you asked, that's what's really important to me about National Skills Coalition's work, right? We work with this network of students and workers and practitioners and businesses that are on the ground in their communities to understand how federal laws are impacting their day to day lives and their communities, and then to make sure that the recommendations that we're making to policymakers are grounded in those real lived experiences. And then we also, right, through things like our Skill Summit, through things like policymaker education meetings, provide an opportunity for local community members to share their stories, their experiences, and the ways that they are positively impacted, for example, by investments in jobs and workforce development through things like the Inflation Reduction Act, or ways that they would be negatively impacted if those investments stopped.
Right. Great. So, with everything that goes on, how does NSC engage with policymakers at the federal level to make sure that skills training and workforce development policies and workforce issues, how do we make sure those things stay a priority when there's so many other things that are going on?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I said this in response to your earlier question, but I think part of the role of NSC is to make sure that we're connecting the issues around skills training and career pathways and supportive services to the larger conversations that are happening around jobs and the economy, right? And we're connecting
Mhm.
those dots for policymakers. And so I think we've seen that working people and small businesses are really facing a lot of economic challenges right now, right? Like that's something that we're seeing in all of the news headlines. It's something that's top of mind in federal policy conversations here in Washington, D.C., where I'm based.
Absolutely.
So that's part of that dot connection is part of what we're trying to do. Yeah, even though that's a big conversation, we're seeing proposals here in DC to cut workforce, to cut education, and to cut safety net programs. And we are concerned that that's going to deepen the economic pain that working people and small businesses are facing, right? And our set of issues have historically enjoyed bipartisan support. So that's part of what we are trying to do is educate policymakers around why some of those cuts, right, would would impact working people and small businesses who want to see more economic opportunity, not less economic opportunity.
Yeah, right, right. You mentioned connecting the dots, and that just reminds me of like how we do when we take people on the Hill for the summit,
Uh-huh.
and these people get a chance to talk to their policymakers, their representatives. We do a lot of fly-ins. So NSC we do play a big part in bringing workers and employers and business owners to the Hill and making sure that they're aware of the policies that are harming or are helping, in some cases, these specific individuals. So wow, I'll cut that out somewhere. On the last episode, I spoke with Robert and he laid out such an incredible quote. He said, and I quote, "In such a divided moment, there are solutions that unite us. These policies have broad appeal. We need bold actions and bold ideas that are practical, but also shape the policy conversation." So, how do we get policymakers to act boldly while ensuring these solutions remain inclusive for everyone, whether it's BIPOC individuals, immigrant workers, etc.?
Yeah. Well, let me back up a little bit because I want to just provide a bit of context around National Skills Coalition's federal policy agenda. So, as you know, we just issued a report in February, right, that made a set of federal policy recommendations. And I'm raising this up because I would say there's kind of two pieces to that, right? As I mentioned, one of the things that we're looking to do is protect programs that are absolutely essential and critical to
Uh-huh.
working people and small businesses, and that are providing a lifeline to people who are working really hard to improve the economic opportunity that's available to them and their families, right? And so,
Right.
you talked about, Tiana, the fact that we engage students and workers in our work, right? And so we're looking at ways to protect proposed cuts to programs or to protect programs, for example, like critical workforce programs, but also critical safety net programs like SNAP and Medicaid that provide those supports that make it possible for people to pursue training while they're working and raising their families. And, one of our student advisors kind of put this beautifully, and I wanted to share a quote from them that people can't worry about getting training if their basic needs aren't met. They're worrying about
Oh,
putting food on their table, how they're going to pay rent, how they're going to have childcare, right? And so part of the work that we're doing through our federal policy agenda is making sure that we're speaking about the need to protect workforce programs, but also our safety net programs like SNAP and Medicaid that really do that work to ensure that people's basic needs are met while they're pursuing skills training, right? And so you'll see that if you take a look at our federal policy agenda. But we can't just be against cuts. We also have to be for things, right? And this is the other part of our policy agenda, right? Where are there opportunities for us to move forward proactive policies that also benefit working people, right? So we might want to say something like, don't cut this program, but do this other thing instead. And I think you'll see
right.
that in our federal policy agenda, and that's a lot of what we're offering. And so, in terms of proactive policy solutions, the Jobs Act is really a good example of a new policy proposal that National Skills Coalition has been supporting for years, right? This is a proposal that would expand Pell Grants to high quality, shorter term training programs. And let me just break this down to make this example really relatable. For some of our listeners, you probably know that the Pell Grant is the primary federal student aid grant program for students with low incomes. And unlike student loans, right, Pell Grants don't have to be paid back. So they are
Nice.
debt-free assistance. We see students, including the students who are in our Student Advisory Council, taking skills training programs at community colleges and in higher education, right? And even though these programs are very popular, the Pell Grant program excludes students who are enrolled in shorter term training programs, right? So that means that adults who might qualify for the Pell Grant, who are training for critical, and essential roles like being phlebotomists, like being commercial truck drivers, like being HVAC maintenance technicians, are oftentimes paying out of pocket to
Uh-huh.
get their skills training at community colleges instead of accessing the same financial aid and financial assistance programs that would be available to them if their programs were just a few weeks longer, right? And so that's something that we are working to change by expanding Pell programs to shorter term, high quality training programs. And by high quality, I mean programs that are going to improve the economic mobility and career advancement goals of students. And so that's a way that we can be advancing, proactive policies that have a lot of bipartisan support while at the same time protecting policies like SNAP and Medicaid and existing investments in workforce development that really are providing a lifeline to so many workers.
Yes, and I am all for a Pell Grant because I am all for free money. That is the perfect way to get an entrance into anything. But like the person you quoted, it's hard to stay in a skills training program and participate and give it all your attention and 100% when you have so many other things in life going on. Maybe you don't have the proper transportation, or maybe you don't have any childcare, which is something that I talked about on the last episode, how childcare is very, very important. So you gave us that example of a policy or initiative that would make a significant impact for workers and businesses. So others have shared how skills training helps specific communities like Black workers and those part of BIPART communities land good quality jobs. How do these policies specifically support those who've historically faced barriers to workforce training and career advancement? Or is there a specific policy that does this already?
Yeah. It's a great question. Well, I want to start by first saying, right, I know there's a lot of conversation going on right now around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And if we are in the workforce field, we should all care about diversity, equity, and inclusion because we all benefit from it as folks who are in the workforce field, right? We've seen lots of research that shows that diverse classrooms and diverse workplaces foster innovation, foster creativity and collaboration, improve critical thinking and problem solving. And those are key skills that we need in our economy today that businesses are looking for and that make workers you know, um, bring skills to the table. And we hold as Americans an aspiration that everyone deserves a fair shot at equal opportunity. But we know that's not, we've seen public policies exclude people from education and jobs and economic opportunities based on their race and gender. And that's resulted in disparities that we still see today in workforce, in education, and in our labor market, right? And so we need policies that really level the playing field for those who have been unfairly disadvantaged. We need policies that reduce barriers that are disproportionately faced by students of color, women, and people with low incomes. And guess what? Policies that do that also achieve better outcomes for everyone, right?
Yeah.
Angela Glover Blackwell, who was a leader at PolicyLink, has done work in this space for a long time, and she calls it the curb cut effect, right? She points out that laws and programs that are designed to benefit people who have been marginalized end up benefiting all of society. When she says a curb
Hmm.
cut, she gives an example of curb cuts that disability advocates won to have better access to sidewalks and to streets. But she also points out how those curb cuts, when you're standing at a corner and the piece of the sidewalk is flat, she points out how those have brought benefits to everyone. And I just want to share, give me a minute here, but I wanted to share an example she provided in an article, that has informed so much of the thinking in the equity field, right? She basically is talking about when curb cuts went into effect. And she says when the wall of exclusion came down, everybody benefited. Not
Uh-huh.
only people in wheelchairs, but parents pushing strollers headed straight for curb cuts.
Yeah, I was
So
just
did
thinking
workers
that.
pushing heavy carts, business travelers wheeling luggage, runners, etc. Right? And so I
Right.
think that's just such a good example of how when we think about policies and design policies in a way to reduce barriers that are disproportionately faced by students of color and women and others, we can create benefits for everyone. It's not a zero sum game. And I would give the example in our context, think about stronger tuition assistance programs for adults, right? National Coalition does a lot of work on tuition assistance programs for adults. Those programs would have an outsized impact on Black adults because Black adults have the highest rates of student loan debt due to longstanding racial wealth and racial income gaps that have been created by generations of policies, that unfairly disadvantaged Black folks. Those tuition assistance programs would have that outsized impact for Black students, but they would also benefit working people of all backgrounds who need college to be more affordable. And so that's some of the ways that we're thinking about how to move forward policies that have positive impacts and benefits for students of color, workers of color, while also benefiting all workers.
Yeah, and I can definitely attest to the having a bunch of student loan debt. I did 4 years at Old Dominion University, and it was not cheap. So that's a good point that you make. And also the curb cuts. Like, I actually never thought about that because I mean, you just see curb cuts everywhere nowadays. You'd
Yeah.
never think that, oh, that was probably for inclusion. Even just a couple weeks ago, I was in Disney with my family and I had to push the heaviest stroller I've ever pushed in my entire life. But it's like the curb cuts helped. That's a good point that you make that once you drop those walls of inclusion, everybody benefits.
Right.
And I don't think a lot of people realize there's a lot of other policies, one of which I won't name, but has to do with being accepted into college that benefits everyone when it's in action. So we talked about kind of how federal policy and legislative priorities can kind of shift. How does NSC go about adapting its advocacy strategies to remain effective?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And, I mean, we're facing a pretty uncertain time here in Washington when it comes to federal policy, right? And so, even though we are navigating through uncertainty, right, we're operating based on a few principles. So, I think that would be the most helpful thing for me to share. And I'm curious to hear if you feel like we're operating according to these principles too. So, the first thing I would say we're doing, right, is really staying focused on the impact we want to have. Even if we stay flexible with the tactics that we then use to get to those impacts, right?
Right.
So, really focusing on our North Star, right? Our North Star being that workers are guaranteed, high quality training, career pathways, and the resources that they need to thrive in their careers and have economic mobility. Thinking about our North Star being that businesses benefit from having a strong, skilled, and diverse workforce, right? And then having a North Star where we have policies that invest in people, that invest in inclusive workforce policies that really make for that better and fairer shared prosperity.
Mhm.
So, really focusing on those outcomes and then being out of the box, being innovative, changing our tactics as we need to make sure that we can get to that set of policies. So, that's one thing I would say. The second thing I would say, right, is that we're really working to center working people, local business leaders, and on the ground practitioners in our advocacy in a way that honors their expertise and their perspectives, right? I think I shared this
Nice.
earlier when I was talking about the economic challenges and pain that we hear from a lot of folks who are on the ground. And so, how do we make sure that we as a coalition are really engaging them and centering their experiences, and then bringing their voices into the conversations that we are having with policymakers, even as those conversations change. And, I've heard people say this both on our Student Advisors Council, but more broadly, those who are closest to the problem and closest to the issue are also closest to the solution, right?
Hmm.
And so, as we think about solutions, making sure that we're really tapping into those on the ground and their direct expertise and giving a platform to have their voices heard, I think is important. And that's meaningful too, right? For policymakers here in DC to hear about the ways that things are impacting their communities and constituents back at home. Um, the third principle I would say that we're operating with is really to make sure that all of our efforts reflect the diversity and the essential contributions of working people, right? Today's
Right.
working class is more diverse than it's ever been. And I think our federal policy agenda shows this, right? We have workers of color and women each make up nearly half of the working class. 1 in 5 workers is an immigrant. And so it's important that the solutions that we are proposing build on the strengths of our diverse working class, and that the solutions that we're proposing, as we've talked about before, Tiana, give everyone a real and fair shot at opportunity. And so that's something that we're always looking at, right? And then finally, as we think about the stories that we're telling, our colleague Katie, who leads our federal advocacy work, likes to say, data makes you credible, stories make you memorable.
Right.
Our colleague Nikisha, who is on that same team, says that stories are data points with a soul, right? And so as we think about the stories that we are telling, the stories that all of our coalition partners are telling, how do we make sure that we're really lifting up and elevating the strengths, the assets, and the dreams that working people have for themselves and their families, and making sure that we're talking about policies as the problem and not people as the problem, right? People aren't the problem. People have a lot to contribute and are contributing. We need policies to change so that people can fully contribute. And so those are some of the guiding principles that we're utilizing as we navigate through uncertainty here.
Yes, and I will say you are dropping some gems today. The one you said, people who are closer to the problem are closer to the solution. I mean, that one, that's tea. I like that. I like that one. Because it just goes to show that a lot of workers who do have these issues, who handle this in their everyday lives, they know exactly what they need. Sometimes they just don't know who to tell about it
Right.
or how to go about getting these things into place. So I think, to your point, do I agree with how we're moving in this year?
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think even just over the last year, we've done a lot of work with workers and students. I mean, we've got our student advisory council now, and we're really kind of putting those voices at the forefront
Mm-hmm.
to help kind of guide our advocacy and let us know exactly what they need, because we do have that platform in order to go and talk to these policymakers and make that impact that is kind of our North Star, as you said.
Yeah, that's right. And, I'll just give a shout out for one of our publications that came out last year. I think it's called What Students Want and Need, or What Students Need. And it is a set of research findings with a set of policy implications based on the work we've done with our Student Advisory Council. And to your point, Tiana, that work was really, deep listening and learning with our Student Advisory Council about what their needs were, and then thinking about what those policy implications are. And that's how we are working to guide the kinds of recommendations that we are putting forward on the Hill, which, by the way, are things supporting working people, supporting small businesses to be able to thrive in the economy and have shared prosperity, is a vision that's shared, by people on both sides of the aisle.
Yep, absolutely. So would you say there's any big challenges that we face in navigating political shifts?
Well, I think this goes back to, and you'll see this in our federal agenda, right? Goes back to trying to keep it, kind of this two-track strategy going around how do we protect some of the investments that have been proposed to get cuts in the upcoming budget cycle, in the upcoming potentially appropriation cycle, while at the same time keeping those proactive policies and longer term opportunities also going on, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, that requires understanding what the cycles are, where the decision points are for members of Congress. It requires also then making sure that we're creating as many opportunities as possible, right? To educate members of Congress utilizing the voices of our network. And I think there's a lot of opportunities as a coalition to work with a number of different stakeholders who come at these things from different perspectives, right? Something that one of our student advisors might share might look different than the experience of a small business owner, but guess what? They might have the same common ask around making sure that students and workers have the supports they need to earn a high quality credential. And so, how do we make space to have those different perspectives come together around a common vision, a common agenda, and a common ask? And I think that's really important, right? To have a variety of different perspectives, a variety of different experiences and voices, all saying, this change or this program is important to me, and here's why. And
Mm.
then why might be different, but they're talking about this program being important from all of these different perspectives. And that's important, right? Because that's how we show that public investments in skills training policies and career pathways and supportive services have benefits for lots of different members of our communities.
Right. So, for anyone listening who wants to help push for these policies, what's the best way they can get involved and make their voices heard?
Yeah, so and you should weigh in here, but I think the first thing I would say, if you're not already, sign up for NSC's email lists. We have 4 different campaigns, issue campaigns that you can also get engaged with depending on what issues matter most to you. So one is on making college work for working people. So, if some of the things I've said about Pell and post secondary education resonate with you, you can get involved with us through that. We have a campaign on making sure that critical investments in infrastructure and job creation, also invest in workers who can access those jobs. So, you can get involved in that. You can get involved with us by signing up for our email list for all of those things. You can follow us on social media. And Tiana, I feel like you can share more about what that looks like. You can come and attend our Skill Summit here in DC, May 5th through 7th, where we will be bringing together leaders from all across the country, our coalition and our network, to talk about solutions and strategies for moving these ideas forward. And then on the third day, they will be talking with their members of Congress and their staff up on the Hill around why these issues matter for their communities. And then you can take action with us. We just recently had an action taking um, where we asked our coalition members to tell members of Congress why programs in the Department of Education really matter for workers and students and small businesses. And lots of people took action with us digitally that way. So those are
Yes,
just
they
some of the
did.
things that come to mind for me. How about you, Tiana? What would you tell people?
Yeah, it's funny that you bring up that we sent out digitally, like people could contact their members
Yeah,
of Congress because someone in our organization actually did that and they got an email back. It wasn't the best email, but I mean, hey, at least we know they're listening and they're seeing these things. So it's like, well, at least I'm on the radar now.
yeah, that's
Um,
right. Yeah, you have to keep at it, right? I mean, I think that's the other thing I would say. Do all of the things that I mentioned now, but National Skills Coalition is going to be providing opportunities for people to engage with their federal policymakers to take
right.
action throughout the year, right? And that's part of the way that you get heard is by not just contacting your member of Congress once or doing one meeting, but continuing to share your perspective, share your experience, have your voice heard. And so that's really important. And my sense is, Tianna, by joining our email list and by following us on social media, those are two of the best ways that people can stay in contact with us around how to take action all year round, even after our skill summit in May.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we post so many things on social media. There's so many different links. There's different ways that we communicate through emails if people want to get involved. I mean, there's a lot of ways you can get involved with
Yes.
NSC. Um, but this has been such a great conversation. I mean, I think I'm gonna have to send this episode to my parents because when they ask me what is it that my organization does? And I tell them, they're like, oh, well, isn't that the job for a representative? And I'm like, well, yes, but like it's also our job to do like the little things that are on the ground and to get people united together so that we can help advocate for these policies. But it was a good conversation just about how NSC works with federal advocacy and how we involve our workers. So thank you so much for your expertise, Brooke. This has been amazing.
Yeah, thank you, Tiana. I'll end by sharing just a personal anecdote with you, which I think speaks to the power of how NSC engages partners and why it's important to get involved. So, I've been at National Skills Coalition now, for 11 years as a staff member,
Oh,
but
wow.
joining National Skills Coalition as a staff member was not my first experience with National Skills Coalition.
Oh,
Prior to
okay.
joining National Skills Coalition, I worked at a small, very small 7-person, small but mighty policy advocacy shop in the District of Columbia that focused on issues facing residents of the District of Columbia. And one of the issues I focused on were issues that faced working poor families in the District of Columbia and working people in the District of Columbia, including workforce development. And so I actually first got involved with National Skills Coalition doing that local work because we realized that some of these federal policies were really shaping what we were able to do at the local level. How the Workforce
Wow.
Innovation and Opportunity Act was structured was shaping the programs that were available to working people in DC. And so I attended a skills summit as a local DC advocate to find out more, right? And not only did I meet with Congresswoman Norton's office, I also met with staff from Maryland because they are important to things that happen in the District of Columbia. And
Absolutely.
that was the first time I had ever done anything like that. Had gone to a skill summit, met people from all across the country and from DC who were working to educate federal policymakers about the way that federal policy was impacting local communities. And so when I decided I wanted to be doing work at a national level, it was really important to me to work for a national organization that really valued and lifted up and elevated the expertise of people on the ground who knew the challenges that their communities were facing and gave us the chance to give voice to that. And so I, of course, thought of National Skills Coalition based on
Uh-huh.
the experience that I had when I was a local advocate. So I will be sure to share this episode with my friends and colleagues who are doing that work on the ground as well, because it's certainly part of how I came to NSC. So thank
Yeah.
you for giving me the opportunity to
I
share.
always wondered how you got to NSE with such a bubbly personality, but I remember you saying that you were an empath, and it's easy to work in these things when you're an empath because you care about other people. So that it definitely makes sense.
So, well, thanks, Tiana. I really appreciate you having this conversation with me and giving the chance to share a little bit about my work at NSC and how we're working really hard to bring everybody into our federal advocacy.
Thank you. This has been great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Make sure you subscribe to our podcast on Apple and Spotify. Be and follow us on social media at Skills Coalition. for updates on all things skills training and workforce development.